Let me know when you want me to start, Vicky.
Yeah, I'd start now, Beth.
Okay. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our 4th webinar. So, today we're looking at how to make child-focused contact plans. And I'm going to be joined by a guest speaker today, Claire Elms from Adoption East Midlands, who's going to talk about the approach that they've taken in her regional adoption agency. But I'm going to start off just with the adopted person's voice, as we're doing with all our webinars. And what do children say about contact planning? So in our longitudinal contact after adoption study, is my slide moving on?
No, it's still on the first slide.
It's not moving.
I'm not sure why that's not moving on. There seems to be something about this presentation my computer doesn't like.
You think you could send it to Carly, because she's the kind of organizer, might be able to share it.
Shall I try and take control and see if I can control
See
it?
if you can take control. Sorry, folks. I can carry on talking while we're doing this. So in our longitudinal contact after adoption study, we last saw the adopted young people when they were aged 17 to 19. And a kind of wrap-up question we asked them at the end of the interview was, what advice would they give to social workers who were planning contact for children being adopted today? And very much, I suppose, their replies emphasised about asking children and children, you know, being able to have their own agency to make decisions. Can you move it, Carly?
I've requested control,
Yeah.
but I don't seem to have any controls to move the slide.
Okay.
Want to pop it to me in an email and I can share it?
Just while that's happening, there's a Q&A box as well. That should be at the top of your screen, so please pop questions in there and hopefully we'll be able to answer them at the end if we've got any time as well. But we're just sorting out the tech issues because that always happens, fortunately.
I think I'm going to, it's something to do with the OneDrive, I think. The blimmin' OneDrive. I'm sending it to you, Carly.
Okay, fab.
I'll keep talking because I can see it now at least. So 4 key messages young people said. First of all, contact should be an option. Secondly, life story materials are important. Thirdly, keep communicating with the child about contact. And fourthly, support is needed beyond age 18. So if we look at this first thing, contact should be an option. it was really the young people saying, I suppose they were at a stage in life where they were thinking, what do we want to do? You know, what kind of relationship do we want to have with our birth family as adults? And they were kind of feeling grateful that that door hadn't been shut a long time ago. So these were mostly young people who had retained some form of contact. And they were saying, well, you know, if something is there, even if it's just a little bit of contact, it gives you something to go on to decide what you want to do next. So they said things like, it's important that the child knows where they've come from and has at least someone of their blood to know. And if you've got any questions, then you've got someone to ask. Another young person said, even if the contact is only brief, I think social workers should ensure the option of staying in contact is always left open. So quite a strong endorsement from young people to social workers. Don't shut the door. Keep the door open when you're making that initial contact plan. And then, I mean, some young people, they said that they said, well, ask the child. You know, the social worker making the plan should ask the child. And I remember saying to one or two young people, well, a lot, you know, like you were adopted when you were 1 or 2, you can't really ask a baby. So then they said, okay, yeah, fair enough. But when children get older, ask them. So our next quote is a young person saying they really need to know how the young child feels about it, but they can't really ask a child who's like 5. But if they're 12 or 13 or even 10, actually ask them what kind of contact they would like. They need to make the options more available for the young people. So, you know, it's a reminder that we have to keep our contact plan under review and bring children's voices in. And they highlighted particularly the support that they were feeling they needed at that current stage in their life to review where to go next. So contact planning is not about just what we do for 1 and 2-year-olds, but it's what we do for 18 and 19-year-olds. Though I suppose when people are 18 and 19, they're making the plan and we're supporting with them. When they're 2, we're making the plan on their behalf. So young people said things like, most organisations, they stop when you're 18. So if I got to 18, I would just be free floating. There are too many options. I wouldn't know where to start. It could be difficult. And another young person said, you know, why doesn't the social worker send a letter to the young person saying, would you like to review contact, rather than the young person having to go to the agency? So, you know, I think these are really important points about contact as not a contact planning as not a one-time event, but something that evolves as the child's agency evolves. Could I have the next slide, please, Carly? But yes, it's all very well. You know, point number 1, listen to children's voices when making with contact plans. Everything I've been reading around contact planning in preparation for this webinar says take children and young people's views into account. But it's complicated for a number of reasons. First of all, as this review of links between contact and children's well-being highlights, it's not always easy for adults to know how children are feeling. Some research that they looked at in this review found that, you know, children often don't tell anybody what they're thinking or feeling around contact. They might be worried about upsetting their adoptive parents or upsetting their birth parents if they don't want to see them anymore. So, you know, children are not always open about their feelings about contact. And also, the child's voice is just one factor. We mustn't put all the weight on the child's voice. It's too much responsibility. We mustn't make children feel responsible for managing complex relationships. We, as you know, adults, have to make those decisions and take that responsibility on their behalf until they're old enough to take that responsibility. Next slide, please, Carly. So what did we learn about contact planning in the theory of change work that we carried out, looking about how and why we need to change the culture around maintaining relationships? So making individualized child-focused plans is a key goal of our culture change. Not that everybody should have a certain type of contact, but that we look at each child's situation individually and move away from standard formula. But we saw a number of barriers to this in our theory of change. First of all, you're trying to do this planning whilst you're in the middle of an adversarial process, and when the child's future adopters are often, not always, but they're often unknown. So that's a really big challenge. There's barriers for everybody in feeding in their views. You know, the child might be too young, the birth parent might be too upset and angry to talk about it. The adoptive parents might not yet be on the scene, or they might, you know, feel they're kind of working in the unknown, really, because they don't really yet know how everything's going to go. So we do have to have this flexible approach to contact planning. In terms of who makes the plans, there seems to be barriers in terms of children's social workers might lack the specialist knowledge around adoption, particularly the lifelong impact. They might not know so much about how contact can play out over time. The adoption social worker hopefully knows more about that, but they don't know the child and the background. So essentially, we need these two workers to work together. CAFCAS obviously have a role in contact planning, but they're not always involved at the placement order stage. So they can inform the plan up until the placement order stage. But then if the adoption order is not contested, they don't know what happens to that plan, and they can't be involved in ensuring that it's followed through. Lawyers and judges or the judges involved all the way through to the adoption order stage. The lawyers for the parents may not be involved at the final hearing, and the child may not be represented at the final hearing. So there's kind of a problem here with the plan at the placement order stage might not be carried out. And so the plan you end up with at the adoption order stage looks quite different. And what judges and lawyers say is that, you know, they are mindful about not restricting the pool of potential adoptive parents. So if an adoption agency says to them, with this plan, we don't know that we can find anybody, that makes, you know, courts fearful of kind of agreeing to certain adoption plans. So lots of kind of barriers to overcome in the process. Could I have the next slide, please, Carly? So I think an overall point I want to make about making plans for children is we're planning their contact. I'm going to use that word as a shorthand today. We need to look at this particular need. What do children need in terms of maintaining relationships with their parents in relation to the broader picture of all their developmental needs? So we need an approach that takes account of the child's relational and developmental needs over time. So we know that adopted children need all the things on this list: belonging and love in their adoptive family, knowledge of their birth family and their history, managing loss and separation, making sense of being in more than one family, and recovering from trauma. And essentially what we have to think about any contact plans is the plan going to promote these needs, or is it going to be detrimental? And we're looking for a plan that on balance is going to promote these developmental needs. If it undermines them, particularly if it undermines that first need for the child to be safe and to benefit from those relationships in the adoptive family, that's a strong indication. So always look about the contact plan in terms of this broader picture of what children need. Could I have the next slide, please, Carly? And now there's a few clicks here, Carly. So if I can have the next click. So I think often when we think about contact plans, we need one more click. We tend to follow rules of thumb in adoption. This is a key problem we've seen in adoption. You know, we might think, well, this child's going to adoption, it will be letterbox, it'll be once or twice a year. That's our plan. That's often our starting point. And I think we need to start at the top. Another click, Carly. What are the goals and purposes? That's our starting point, not what do we usually do? What's our standard formula? And one more click, please, Carly. So this model for planning contact is set out in this practice guide that is published on the UEA and Research in Practice Contact in Adoption website. It's freely available to download, and I'll kind of return to and talk my way through this model of contact planning as we go on. But for now, I'm going to hand over to Claire. Have you got the next slide, Carly? So over to Claire, who's going to talk a little bit about this contact planning process and also look at making individual plans for children. So thank you so much for sharing with us, Claire. And we need to take our slide down now, Carly, so Claire can put hers up.
Thank you, Beth. Yeah, I'll just you just confirm that my presentations come up on the beginning slide, please.
Yeah, I can see that, Claire.
Lovely. Okay, thanks. So yeah, thank you for your introduction, Beth. So yeah, my name is Claire Elms, and I'm one of the team managers in the adoption support team for Adoption East Midlands. Just a little bit about Adoption East Midlands. So we regionalised as a regional adoption agency in April 2019. We make up 4 local authorities: Nottinghamshire, Nottingham City, Derbyshire and Derby City, with Nottinghamshire being our host local authority. So I'm part of the adoption support team. We're quite a large team supporting all 4 authorities, and within our team, so we're overseen by a service manager. Then there's 3 of us who are managers. We have an advanced practitioner, 17 social workers, soon to hopefully be 18, 4 birth family support workers. We're hoping to have 2 more joiners later on next year. We've got 1 senior social work support officer and then 4 social work support officers. So thinking about your introduction, Beth, and why you invited me here today, what we've kind of been up to in Adoption East Midlands is thinking about our contact planning and the fact that in order to affect change that there needs to be support. And we've kind of looked at this in 2 areas. We recognised that we needed to support our adopters. First of all, thinking about adoption from a pre-approval perspective, and just thinking about that message that we start to deliver to people who are wanting to adopt, sort of coming through that front door, and just that idea of sort of needing adopters to be more open-minded to keeping in touch arrangements. So really starting to think about the message that we give pre-approval. But not only do we want to support our adopters, but it's also about thinking about the support that our social workers are going to need. And by social workers, I mean those in our adoption, so our recruitment, assessment and placement team. So those assessing adopters, but also our children's social workers in our district teams and in our permanence teams to help sort of shift that message. So if we think about, first of all, thinking from a pre-approval stage, we wanted to kind of change the message from as soon as really somebody picked up the phone and was sort of made an inquiry about adoption. So in terms of information evenings and initial visits, we wanted to kind of start to drip feed the message around keeping in touch at a very sort of lightly focused, but still kind of starting to shift the message rather than it just being like the word letterbox kind of used all the time. And then our what was called the pre-approval training, so that's now called our learning and development training. We've done quite a big piece of work around rethinking our workshops. So what we did is we met as a working party to kind of co-create and re-look at what the sort of life story, contact and telling workshops were in the pre-approval stage. So the working party consisted of myself, the advanced practitioner, our social worker who leads on keeping in touch. We had some representatives from the recruitment and assessment and placement team, social workers, and then social workers from our permanence team. So that's the team that write the child permanence report. So we met last year over the course of many months to co-create a new standalone workshop, and from next year that'll be introduced. So this is a more detailed workshop focusing on keeping in touch arrangements and the importance of the child's identity, the sense of belonging and self, and really starting to deliver that message about contact planning not being just like you said earlier, Beth, like letterbox from the outset, and that actually keeping in touch arrangements can change, and starting to sort of shift the message about arrangements being fluid. And within this workshop, we were really fortunate that we've interviewed a birth father as part of and sharing his lived experience of opening up keeping in touch arrangements with his daughter and her adoptive mum, and then with an adoptive parent who's having something more creative with the birth mums of her children. And then we also have a question and answer session with our birth family support workers, just to give examples of the work that they are doing to support our birth families, just to try and break down those barriers of the idea of maybe birth family members being quite scary, and also that people's circumstances change. So what adopters may have read many years ago in a child's permanence report at the point of an ADM actually could be very different. And what we know is that actually for a lot of our families, they go on, they may have children in a new relationship with no social care involvement. So we really wanted to shift that early message. And so just to kind of give an overview, the content of the new workshop, it sort of looks at what is it that a child needs. We're able really to try and capture the voice of the child, looking at the importance of sibling relationships, supporting family links, breaking down those barriers, exploring prospective adopters' fears, but also birth family fears, because what we know is there's a lot of power imbalance between our adoptive families and our birth families. The importance of ongoing life story work, and this idea that something may be letterbox to start, but actually in the future we can have something quite creative when it comes to keeping in touch arrangements. Like I just said a second ago, it'll include the videos. And overall, the emphasis on this standalone workshop is birth family relationships, the child's identity, that circumstances change, but that also support is available. And I think just picking up on what you said earlier, Beth, just about that plans are flexible. So that's kind of looking at the message we're wanting to shift for those pre-approval, but then thinking about post-approval and just kind of reaching our adoption community. There's a few things that we've been doing just to kind of let them, like our adopters, know what is available. So when you access adoption support in Adoption East Midlands, the way you kind of come into our service, if you like, is by completing something called a pathway assessment. So what we've actually done on that document is actually put a prompt around the child's keeping in touch arrangements, just as a way of asking them like how it's going, if they want to talk about that, have they got any thoughts, what's working, what's not, just to kind of keep it on the agenda. The second thing we've done is to put a little prompt at the end of an adopter's reminder about their prompt letter for letterbox. So again, it's just if you want to talk to someone about your child's keeping in touch arrangements, please get in touch and here's the number. And then the other thing that we've been working on last year and we launched at the beginning of the year is this idea of offering keeping in touch consultations, and that we can then support and review arrangements. So just a little bit more about the development of our keeping in touch offer. What we did is we now offer two weekly kit consultations, because what we realised is if we were going to grow and shape as a service, we needed to be able to resource the support needed to affect this change. So we've got we're very fortunate that we shifted around one of our team members' roles within adoption support, and she became our lead keeping in touch social worker. So she's got many years of experience and knowledge, already doing ad hoc pieces of keeping in touch, but as of February this year, this became her lead role. So she puts 2 days a month aside for these consultations. So they're for two sort of main groups of people. Our first one is the social workers. So this is usually our permanent team social workers who are at their CPR writing stage. They'll be thinking of keeping in touch planning, and it's just to kind of open up those discussions about what they're thinking, rather than just having sort of that standalone annual letterbox without the exchange of photographs. Just really thinking about what is in the best interest of that child, who's important to them, why they're important, what are you wanting to achieve. So that just might be a one-off consultation just to talk through your thoughts and feelings. And it is really just to help you think about the child and what plan you would like to achieve. Then we also offer the consultation to adopters. Now, at the moment, we're finding that a lot of these adopters that are coming to us for these consultations are people who may have adopted sort of 3, 5, even longer years ago, and just realizing that actually their keeping in touch arrangements for their child is just not in their best interest anymore. It's not working. It's quite rigid in what the plan is, and they're just wanting to talk through what could be achievable, but also what support's available. And so they are working incredibly well. So we launched this at the end of February this year. And just to sort of share a few figures with you all. So pre-February, our keeping in touch social worker had done 6 consultations and 6 pieces of sort of more creative keeping in touch pieces of work, but they were kind of done ad hoc while she was still undertaking her other role within our team. But since the offer has gone live, she's offered 30 consultations. And as you can see from the graphs, there's a large proportion of those that have been with our adopters, and then a few with our social workers. And of those 22 consultations, 10 have required further exploration around previous risk. 12 have progressed to supporting something different with the family, and 8 were NFA. But just to say, those that were NFA, there's no reason why they can't come back at another stage, and it's all kind of documented within our recording system. So then we just thought it would be nice to share a couple of examples of the work that we've been doing. So this first one, so this started last year. So this was with a birth father who'd never engaged in any letterbox exchange with the adoptive mum of his daughter. His daughter was adopted when she was 5. She's now 12. She has really fond memories of her birth father, and she was really struggling that he'd never engaged in letterbox. Little girl is dual heritage, adoptive mum is white, and she was really wanting to know more about birth father and his culture. So adoptive mum contacted our team, asked if we could locate birth father and see if we could re-engage him in some form of keeping in touch. So we were able to locate Dad, which was great, and he was really grateful. He kept saying how grateful he was about the opportunity to sort of reconnect with his daughter. So over the last 18 months, the social worker first helped birth father to write his first letter, which his daughter was so happy to receive. And from there, we built up to video calls. So that first of all started between the social worker, the adoptive mum and birth father, just to give both families the opportunity to build that relationship and that rapport. And so there was trust between them. Then the adoptive mum felt quite confident to set up an email address. This was a confidential email address that she just used to exchange emails with birth father. And those emails took place bi-monthly. And this enabled the little girl to be able to ask questions. She shared lots of artwork, but she didn't have to wait. There wasn't that waiting time of the yearly exchange. Then we built up even more, and our kit social worker did some quite a lot of prep work with the girl before she also joined a video call. She was very clear to the social worker that the social worker needed to lead on the endings and the goodbye. And we also did some further prep work with birth father. So then we did have the video calls. Again, these worked. They were amazing. They were really positive. The feedback was fantastic. And after the video call between the girl and her birth father and adoptive mum, again, adoptive mum felt confident to be able to facilitate video calls without the support from the social worker. And then we're really happy to share that in the summer of this year, the social worker actually supported the first direct meeting between the two families. And again, that was a great success. And now that will be maintained yearly in the summer. And then in between times, the video calls will continue 3 monthly. And now we've got no involvement with this family, but again, they know they can come back if they want to revisit the keep in touch arrangements or just need any support. They're aware that we can offer that support. And then another more recent example to share is of a sibling group of 5 children. The 2 eldest children had a plan on an SGO to maternal grandparents, and the 2 middle children had a plan of adoption. And then when the 5th child was born, they too had a plan of adoption, but were adopted by a separate family. The little boy, the 8-year-old little boy, was really struggling with the loss of his older siblings. The girl too, but the boy in particular was really struggling. He'd always lived with his older siblings and just really struggling not having that connection maintained. So, and what had been the plan was a letterbox exchange between birth mother and the adopters, and then grandparents. And then just to add that birth mother was still seeing her older children directly. That it was their arrangement. So again, the adopters rang and asked for a consultation just to discuss what it might look like opening up the arrangements with the maternal grandparents. But the main consideration was how this would be managed with birth mum, who was obviously still having direct contact with her older children. But also it was tricky because the adopters of the baby, who were having direct contact with the adopters of the other children, they didn't want to open anything up. So there was a lot to kind of work through and manage. So the kit social worker actually worked alongside the permanent social worker who were still involved with the siblings in grandparents' care to work towards. So doing some preparing work, working with birth mother to understand that if this would happen, this wouldn't change her arrangements for now and how that would be managed. And actually birth mum, we were really lucky. She was really accepting of this plan and just happy that her children were going to see one another and that her parents would be seeing her children. And so earlier, a few months ago, these meetings took place. They started with video calls between the 2 families in terms of the adults, and then worked way up to direct meeting. And now the younger children are seeing their siblings. So that's going really, really well. And then I suppose it's just to kind of mention that for us, we feel our next steps are to look at the review of support for our sort of 18 to 25s, including their keeping in touch support and arrangements post 18. Because actually we know for a lot of our young people, even when they reach 18, emotionally they're still very young and actually still want that support and what that support could look like. So that's sort of us for our next steps. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claire. It's absolutely amazing, particularly to hear those practice examples and just how meaningful the change has been for those families and all the work that went into it, and how people did genuinely consider every option, and interesting creative use of digital methods as well to bridge the gap from not having direct contact to people meeting up and spending time together. So thank you so much for sharing those processes.
No problem. Thank you.
Now, Carly, shall I try and put my share my screen?
Feel free to have a go. If not, I've got your slides.
Yeah. Is that working now? Looks
Yeah, looks great.
Good. Okay, so what I want to focus on mostly for the rest of the talk is how do we pull together the information about the kind of strengths and the risks in a situation to work out what our contact plan might be. We need to think about the child, the birth relatives, and the adoptive parents here. So I want to start with the child. So the research on contact in adoption shows consistently that, you know, a number of child factors are important to consider. The history of the child's relationship with birth relatives. Has there been a positive relationship? Has there been a difficult, neglectful, or abusive relationship? Will make a massive difference. The child's wishes and feelings. Who's important to the child? You know, finding out about those brothers and sisters that children just do not want to lose touch with, or the relatives that children do not want to see because they're frightened of them. We need to take account of children's reactions to the contact that has happened so far. And we need to know about children's memories of their birth family, but we also need to look at the kind of strengths that children have in the current day and their capacity to cope with contact, because contact does have a level of stress to it. And to sum things up, you know, children who are more settled, who have good relationships with their adoptive parents, who are getting on well generally in life, cope better with those stresses of contact. And children who have other stresses that they're managing, maybe problems in attachment with their adopters, emotional behavioural problems, might find it more difficult to cope with contact. So lots of child factors to take into account. Generally speaking, when children are older, the maybe need to maintain relationships is more apparent, but there's likely to be more complicating factors. When children are adopted very young, there's maybe less of an immediate direct need to maintain relationships, but those children will cope with the contact often better because they have more advantages in other ways. So I think a really key question for contact, for thinking about children, is how is it actually going to affect them, and how do we distinguish between contact that is difficult, which there's all sorts of things we do in life that are difficult but worthwhile, and contact that is harmful. So in the overview of contact research by Aya and colleagues, they ask the question, you know, they say we have to think, is contact safe and meaningful? Now, in a recent study in Belgium, where caseworkers were asked how they assess contact, they identified over 50 different factors that they took into account when deciding about contact for kids in care. And one of them, what they consider to be the most important factor, is children's emotional safety when they're spending time with their birth family. So they felt it was one of the most important factors, but also the hardest to assess. The longitudinal follow-up of young people in open adoptions in Australia highlighted that contact was often painful in the short term, but beneficial in the long term. And a lot of adopted people as adults look back on their contact and said, yeah, it wasn't easy, but I'm glad I had it. Not everybody, though. Some people felt it had not benefited them at all. Some people felt it had harmed them and they wished that it had stopped. So we can think of a spectrum really of contact that's maybe completely positive, right through to contact that is re-traumatizing for children. And we have to identify where the line is crossed between difficult and harmful. So in a study we carried out where we focused just on direct contact after adoption, adoptive parents described children's reactions to contact. And some people, you know, were describing situations that just seemed wholly positive. So for example, Bobby was having contact with his brother and it was just a joy, as the quote from his adoptive mum shows. It was just something he looked forward to, he absolutely treasured and enjoyed, and was really positive. In other cases, children really enjoyed the contact, but it was tinged with sadness often. So Rachel's mum said she looks forward to it, she enjoys it. Afterwards, she's always okay. It's sad, but not difficult. She's sad she's not going to see them for a while. In other situations, the level of difficulty can be higher. So again, in the direct contact study, one adoptive mother said, again about sibling contact, that her daughter hates goodbyes. She's had so many goodbyes. And of course, when she has a goodbye with her sister, especially at first, it brings back all the other ones. She was very upset afterwards. She was in tears. And another young person in our longitudinal study described some of the difficulties of contact for her. She lived with her grandparents when she was very young. She didn't really remember them because she was so tiny. And then when she was adopted, that contact was cut off. But she reconnected with them in middle childhood. And she wanted that contact, but she found it difficult and stressful. As she described it, it was good to know I was being thought of, but at the same time, I still feel like they know me and I don't feel like I know them. I felt a lot of pressure meeting them, as I do meeting new people. There's a hint there, going back to what I was saying about young people who maybe find just a lot of different social situations difficult, might find the contact situation more difficult. Further along that spectrum towards where children might not feel emotionally safe, things to look out for are, children's feelings and behaviours before and after the contact. So, adoptive parents, or if you're looking at what the plan should be after adoption, foster carers might describe tension in the lead up to the contact meeting, or stirring up of difficult feelings, children being reminded of painful or traumatic events during contact, and disturbance coming out after contact meetings. So if you think if there's a build up to contact that's affecting children's functioning, and then there's a fallout after contact that's affecting children's functioning, and this goes on for weeks, and you're having contact even just 4 times a year, it doesn't leave the child enough periods of calm in their life to focus on all those other developmental tasks. But I think we have to not just think about, in situations where contact is difficult, if children want it and we feel there's benefits in persisting with it, we have to think about how can we improve the quality so that children do feel safe. So that might be about trying to resolve how the contact meeting is handled, resolve tensions between people outside of the meetings, or help develop the capacity of adoptive parents or birth parents to make the contact a positive experience for the child, and how to promote choice and a sense of control for the young person. So we'll come back to the need for trauma-informed support for contact in our later webinars. And finally, we have to be really aware of when children should not be having contact, maybe not having contact of any kind for a period with certain birth relatives. So Howe and Steele write about this in a chapter that builds on an attachment theory perspective. And they give a case example of Sophie, a young girl who was placed for adoption at 13 months and who'd been severely physically abused by her birth mum. And the contact notes that built on the contact she was having whilst in care described really Sophie really freezing during contact. She would stand motionless, staring blankly into the air, sometimes rubbing her eyes, suggesting dissociative behaviour. She makes no move towards her mother, never smiles, and if picked up, she remains stiff and speechless, looking glazed. And then after the contact, we see this really signs that she's been re-traumatized in her behavior. So we need to really be alert to these situations as well. In terms of birth relative factors, we discussed these in our webinar on birth parents. Positive factors that makes us think, yes, contact is going to be a quality experience for the child is where birth relatives can support the child's adoption and affirm the adoptive parents, where they can adjust to their own changed role, where they can collaborate with adoptive parents, where they can show positive non-abusive behaviours with the child, where they're reliable, they can do what they say they're going to do in the plan, and where they can accept the harm that's being caused to children and show remorse for that. But again, it's not just about birth relatives being able to do this or not do this. How can we build parents' capacity to make this positive contribution to contact? So here's an example of a practice resource here that's been developed in Australia and adapted for use in England. So do get in touch with the Vicky Swift from the National Adoption Team if you want to access these resources. This is a leaflet that parents can use to help them think about how their child might be feeling during contact, everything else that's going on for the child, and what they can do when they meet up with their child. For example, tell them you're proud of them, reassure them that you're okay, celebrate the positives with them. So it helps the parent to understand what they need to do to make contact feel safe and meaningful to their child. Adoptive parents, again, we looked at this in our last webinar. It's really very much about that openness to contact. And Claire talked about how these attitudes can be shaped from the start with adoptive parents. That communication openness that we talked about in our adoptive parent webinar. We know that when adoptive parents have these kinds of attitudes and skills around relating to the birth parent, a collaborative approach, an empathic approach, that makes contact go much, it scaffolds the child's experience. It can help the child feel safe in that contact scenario, whether it's looking through a letter with the child or taking them to meet their birth family. So I think once we've assessed all these different factors, that's the point we think about, okay, so what can we achieve with the contact plan? We need to think that systemically, we need to look at all parts of the system and think about how, when we put people together, how they're going to affect each other. We need to ideally involve everybody concerned in the process. So Claire's example was really great at showing how this is done. You know, when you've got a support worker who can reach out to a parent, and you've got your keeping in touch worker who can work with the adoptive parent and the child, then you can really get a plan that is co-constructed with the family. That's the ideal situation. It's hard to achieve at the initial planning stage when you're in contested proceedings. We need to make realistic plans based on our understanding of strengths and risks. I think it's better to start with a plan that is achievable and to have success and build on it. I think Claire's examples really show that. You know, start with a letter, that goes well. Start with messages or video calls. Build up to something. So at each step, people are succeeding and you're building their positivity, rather than, you know, go straight in with an ambitious contact plan that fails. I think when we're thinking about direct contact, meeting up with birth family, we have to plan for adoptive parents to be present throughout, because they are the child's secure base. That's really important. It's good to think in the plan about the details and the boundaries, so everybody knows where they stand and nobody accidentally does the wrong thing later on. And as we've said throughout today's webinar, we have to be tentative and build in opportunities for review. There are a range of resources out there that can help with contact planning. So the practice guide I mentioned earlier is online. The Safe and Meaningful Contact Guidelines. Some RAAs are investing in training their staff in this model. It builds very much on the research that I've talked about today and assesses the factors that I've talked about today. There's resources on the Core and BAF website and the Nuffield Family Justice Observatory website. So there is stuff out there to help you. And I just wanted to finish with the recommendations of the Public Law Working Group to come back to this idea of how can we improve the planning process. So the Public Law Working Group published some recommendations relating to adoption in September of this year, and they were out for consultation up until the end of last week, the 30th of November. So soon we shall see what their final recommendations are. But the preliminary recommendations relating to contact were really that we should identify important people at the pre-proceeding stage and map out those relationships in the social work evidence template. There should be this early liaison of the child social worker and the adoption social worker, that keeping in touch consultation that Claire talked about, where you consider the full range of contact. And in the adoption support plan that goes to the court, it should be clear what the support for contact is going to look like. The role of CAFCAS then is to really investigate, has the investigation of contact been broad enough? And finally, to deal with that problem of maybe the plan that's put forward just not being enacted, and then it's not reviewed at the adoption order stage, to consider, not in every case, or really maybe even in the majority of cases, but in some cases where there's a compelling need that you've got this plan and it needs to be carried out, that we use a Section 26 contact order. So this is a contact order that just lasts only until the adoption order. So it's not committing adoptive parents to having a contact order for the rest of the child's minority. It's just, you know, to ensure that that plan is carried out up until the adoption order stage. And there was a recent comment on this from Sir Andrew McFarlane, who's the head of the family courts, saying, you know, some people might raise objections about this, saying it's going to hinder the task of finding prospective adopters. You know, it might put prospective adopters off. And he was really arguing in his speech that he doesn't agree that courts should be deterred in making a contact order. If they feel that's absolutely what the child needs, they should make that order because it's the best interests of the child that are paramount. So it'd be interesting to hear your views about that. And here's some of the research that I've used in preparing the talk today, but I'm going to stop and hopefully we can have just one or two questions. Thank you so much for listening.